If you look back from 1900 to 2021, and you compared our society to a human being, what would you say have been the stresses and traumas and tragedies that have been inflicted on ordinary individuals, ordinary families, ordinary communities, and the entire nation over the course of almost 120 years? The more you reflect on it and you have a historical perspective, the more you see that Rwanda is a broken society that is desperately in need of healing. The importance of healing is that it's at the heart of everything else you are going to do, because people need to have a degree of normalcy or normality in order to function. If you are functioning in a state of trauma, untreated trauma, unresolved trauma, you are operating at suboptimal capacity. You're working really, if your capacity should tend towards 180%, you're probably operating at 20%. And that is why doing these kinds of things that I'm talking about is very important for Rwanda, not simply because we need to live better lives, but it's also because without doing these other problems will not be resolved. My name is Theo Ruda. I'm a native of Rwanda. It's a pleasure to have this conversation because it tells the story of an individual and a family, and yet in a much larger sense, it actually tells the story of a nation and the story of a people. I was reflecting a lot on this conversation as we prepared for it, and it occurred to me that the larger part of my life, I would say over 80% of my life, I've been living as a refugee outside my country. And that tells the larger story of my nation and my people. I have lived for the last, almost 20 years in the United States. And 3 of those years, 3 to 4 years, I was here living as an ambassador of my country after the genocide of 1994 and the civil war that preceded it or took place alongside the genocide. But for the last 16 years, indeed, I had to live here again, this time in exile as a refugee alongside my family of 6. And I've lived as a refugee literally in many countries, but notably, if you look at the map of where Rwanda is situated, you'll see that it has neighbors, Burundi, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, and Tanzania. And so I've lived as a refugee in all those countries before I came to live as a refugee here in the United States. On the larger map of the world, actually you can hardly see Rwanda. That's how small it is. Even on the map of Africa, it hardly can be seen. But its problems and its tragedies far outsize its physical size. Right now, we're a population of about 12.5 million people on a very small patch of land. And we're one of the most densely populated areas in the whole world. It's inhabited by 3 ethnic groups. They would find the Twa, a very small percentage of the population. Then next would be Tutsi, They say could be 10 to 15%. Really, nobody knows because it's very complicated. I'll be explaining that later. And then the majority Hutu, who it is said could constitute maybe 85% of the population. So it's these three ethnic groups who've inhabited these hills of Rwanda. We speak the same language, Kinyarwanda, so we live on the same hills. And throughout history, it is believed that there were intermarriages, especially between the Hutus and the Tutsis. And so this is something that it's very important to know, because sometimes if you're explaining this to a foreigner, they may probably think that Hutus and Tutsis and Twas, often the Twas are forgotten because of the very, very small numbers. But sometimes people think they are races, but we're not races. We have so many things in common, and it has always surprised people why, if these people have so much in common, why would there be so much hatred and animosity and all the things or the bad things that have happened to us, especially in the last couple of decades. So those are the people who inhabit the country. The story of Rwanda has been mostly oral. It's handed over from generation to generation from what the previous generation narrates to the younger generation. So we are a storytelling kind of society until, of course, the advent of European intervention in Africa. And until the Europeans came to Rwanda, which, as I said, was towards the end of the 19th century, Rwanda was ruled by kings. And kings were exclusively from one ethnic group. The slightly larger minority, the Tutsi, larger than the Twas, the kings were drawn from these ethnic groups and from one particular clan. And that's how, from century to century, Rwanda was ruled. European intrusion in Africa took place after the famous Berlin Conference of 1984 to 1995. And that's when the European imperial powers thought to divide the whole world amongst themselves, and in particular to divide Africa amongst themselves. From then onwards, after that military conquest, that means that the superior power on the land was no longer the king, the Tutsi king. It was now the German emperor through a military representative of a governor or a governor who ruled this country called Rwanda. When the fortunes of the Germans declined at the end of, during the First World War in 1916, that's when the Belgians, because they were part of the victors of that war, Rwanda exchanged hands from the German rule now to Belgian rule. If I fast forward then towards the end of the colonial era, that would be late 50s, early 60s for most African countries. Rwanda became independent in 1962. But this independence from Belgium in 1962 was preceded by violence, inter-ethnic violence, political violence, because independence was gained also at the same time when the monarchy was formally abolished. So the kings who had run Rwanda for centuries, Tutsi kings who had run for centuries, for the first time lost power. They lost power now to the majority Hutu. So for the first time in the history of Rwanda, the Hutu majority were thrust into power because the Hutu elite who fought for independence, they also fought that they should cease to be subjects, that they should also be part of history by being in the power structures of the country. So the independence was gained, it is, as the African proverb goes, it was killing two birds with one stone. Freedom from the colonizers and freedom from the monarchy that had ruled the country for centuries. It was a very violent process, and that is when Rwanda, for the first time, generated refugees in big numbers. And so that begins then the trajectory of Rwanda from the time of independence up to now. Because whereas I mentioned that the Hutu came to power, it's a generalization. Because even when the Tutsi kings were in power, you cannot say that all the Tutsis were in power. But the kings hailed from one ethnic group, and so where you could have a president and minister hailing from the Hutu majority, it's a generalization, a broad generalization, because power everywhere on this planet, historically and everywhere, has been of particular groups who are in power, sometimes in the name of a tribe, in the names of a race, but that's a gross generalization, because in 1973, the Hutu president who had come to power through the violent Hutu revolution of 1959 was overthrown in 1973 by his own fellow Hutu. A general staged a military coup d'etat and removed him from power. And in fact, in a couple of years, 3 to 4 years, both the first president of Rwanda after independence and several of his colleagues who had championed the revolution in 1959 were to be killed in very violent ways. And that's one I will be talking about it, one of the sad chapters of Rwanda that remains unclosed. And so the military guy who becomes the president of Rwanda from 1973 rules until 1994, because if you fast forward the story of modern Rwanda towards the close of the 20th century, is that 2 presidents are shot down in a plane on April 6, 1994, and hell breaks loose in our country. So really that's the beginning of the recent troubles of Rwanda, the civil war of 1990 and the genocide of 1994 that was waged between our organization, the Tutsi rebels, against the government of the day. And the Hutu president of the country then, who had signed an agreement with us, was assassinated. His plane was shot down, and him and the president of the neighboring country, Burundi, were both killed instantly, and all the people who were on board. And that triggered the killings, the genocide that targeted mainly Tutsis, because we were Tutsis, so it was like saying, okay, if this happened, then we're going to target your own people, kill them, and we see what happens. But it also targeted Hutus. And since then, which is another story, the killings also took place that targeted the Hutu population. When you look at all these injuries that have been inflicted on the Rwandan person for a very, very long time, then you realize that the Rwandan society is a society with intense trauma that is desperately in need of healing. If Rwanda was a human being, you would say, oh, this person has post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. So we're a country that really is, and even up to now, as we speak, we're a country on edge. For somebody who has lived through all these traumatic experiences, at some point also briefly being in power, I ask myself, how can we help our society to heal? How can it heal? How could we make these hills on which blood has been flowing, how could we make them hills of healing? If we just try to look around the whole world of what other societies have done, even reflecting on where we are this morning and where I have been, the places we've visited this morning, reflecting on the life of Abraham Lincoln, an American who lived in another era, who lived in an exceedingly traumatic periods of this nation's history, the American story, for helping to end slavery and also for the Civil War to unite the country. But he died during that. He didn't live for very long to see what would happen after the Civil War, to see how the country would put itself together and begin to heal, even when most of the problems that he witnessed and he tried to respond to solve, even when they did not end abruptly, but he would say that has been a big contributor in the history of his people, the history of this country, to continue to look for solutions. So being in this place this morning inspires me to think about the possibility and to have hope that it's possible to heal, and that journey begins with each one of us. It begins with me, it begins in my family, it begins in my community, and collectively that process of healing can take a national dimension as a whole nation and people, in this case the Twa, the Hutus and Tutsis, undertake this project of beginning today to walk the long journey of beginning to heal. And I've thought of a number of things that we could entertain and begin to work with. The first one, in that process of beginning the journey of healing, is actually acknowledging that you have a problem. It is so with all of us, whether it's all sorts of things that we human beings undertake in the whole trajectory of life, from the time we are born up to the time if we are graced enough, we live up to 70, 80, or even 100. The human condition is such that we do go through periods of time when we know that our minds and our bodies and our spirits are not in the right place, and we've got to respond to that. On the surface, we may project calmness. So as a society, we've got to realize that we inflicted a lot of damage, a lot of trauma on each other, and foreigners have inflicted a lot of damage on us. And very often, even when foreigners have become a problem to us, it has often been because we are very weak, and we're very weak because we don't see eye to eye. We have all these troubles amongst ourselves, and we have groups who, in order to acquire power and maintain power, they are willing to draw all of us into the frenzy of self-destruction. And so we've got to acknowledge we have a problem and talk about it. And this is not easy, because even to acknowledge and talk about it is an exceedingly difficult conversation, because whenever we start a conversation, it becomes a blame game. who did this in 1900. Look at the colonialists who did this to us. Look at the people who collaborated with the colonialists. And often it's, the Rwandans can point to either ethnic group. So you acknowledge, but you also have to endeavor to stop the trauma. If you know that there's something in your life that is piling up these layers of trauma, then to begin the journey to recovery and restoration simply conditions you to think that it's time to stop that trauma so that you can have breathing space to begin to recover. In the case of Rwanda, often this trauma has also been external in terms of it's not ordinary people who wake up one morning and say, oh, we want to go and kill our neighbors. Governments have been involved. Small groups of people who have vested interests are very much interested in something like that. Or sometimes it's outside the country, outside forces that are. But at the end of the day, the trauma is also internal. And so there has to be an effort to stop the trauma at different levels. And so the trauma that is ongoing today as we speak, ongoing from various sources, including our own trauma that we inflict on ourselves, that also has to stop so that you're given some kind of breathing space to begin to see for yourself how you can participate in that kind of journey. So stop the trauma. So acknowledge, stop the trauma, but then you've got to create a safe environment. You've got to create a safe environment in which these things can begin to be talked about. Because once again, acknowledging and stopping the trauma involves saying things that may be offensive, because each one of us has erected a particular narrative. And if somebody has a different narrative from what you have, it's quite offensive. We blame each other. We are operating on very low levels of trust. And so creating a safe environment in which we can comfortably, or at least not comfortably, but at least to be able to tell our story. Yes, to be able to tell our story as it is, in the hope that if I put myself in your shoes and you put yourself in my shoes, we can begin to figure out how much pain we've caused to each other, and together we can figure out how we can be of help to each other in that joint process, because it's a journey that we undertake individually, but also we undertake it collectively. In the case of Rwanda today, it's not possible to have a safe conversation. It carries a penalty, and a very heavy penalty, because talking about truth in Rwanda is extremely, for some people, it's extremely divisive. Those who are in power consider it to be extremely divisive. And those who may be out of power may also look at Rwanda. As I said, we look at each episode in our history and we interpret it the way we want. And often it is in terms that blames the other and does not take into account the whole society suffering from these repeated stressful developments that take place in people's lives. And so creating a safe environment is very important. And it's a very, very difficult thing to do in Rwanda, because you may suffer more trauma simply because you've dared to tell the truth. I could not sit in Rwanda today and have this conversation. And what I'm saying today will be censored in Rwanda. People will not be allowed to watch it. It's only in exile where I have the freedom, and I would even dare say the luxury of being able to say what is on my mind, even when it is a peaceful message. It's a message of healing. In Rwanda, the authorities would see this as being very, very subversive. As probably many people know, anybody who would go on Google would figure out that I've been sentenced to 24 years in jail in 2011 because I wrote with others a small paper, not small because it was 50 pages, in which the things I'm saying today, I put them in writing. I was a lead author of that paper. It's called Rwanda Briefing. You can find it online. I was sentenced to 24 years in jail. There are many people who are in jail today because they have dared to say the kind of things that I'm trying to say. So it carries a very heavy penalty to say what is on your mind, especially if you want to look at the injuries that collectively Rwandan society has had to bear and which we've inflicted on each other. And certainly we have to creating a safe environment, stopping the trauma and acknowledging all this allows us then to build story by story the trust that is the missing oil, the missing lubricant of thriving individuals, thriving families, and thriving communities. Whenever society is operating on low trust, you can be sure they are likely to be very, very complex problems that become even more complicated. And society can live from bad to worse simply because it's operating on low trust. And it's much easier to destroy whatever trust there is, and it's exceedingly difficult to rebuild it. And for now, all the things that I've mentioned in our history have been depleting the trust amongst ourselves. And so, story by story, building that kind of trust becomes important. And that would enable us to move on many other fronts in these pathways of healing. Having said that, we have to undertake to build trust because it allows us now to work together. Because if I don't trust you and you don't trust me, how on earth could you even contemplate that we can begin to work together? That would be extremely difficult and often impossible because we're working at cross paths, because often our mindset is a mindset which, economists and strategies call a zero-sum game, where if you gain, I consider it to be my loss. And if I gain, I consider it to be your loss. And so we need the trust and the safe environment in order to begin to experiment on working together. We call them the networks of cooperation and collaboration, because that is really, really extremely significant in enabling us to work together, because healing, although I say it begins with each one of us, but the saying that no man or woman is an island unto themselves is truly a truth, because we need each other in order to achieve, especially once you begin to be a family and a community and a nation. There are several interests and several stakeholders, and working together becomes extremely important. The last of the pathways that I mentioned here, which is key and which is important, is leadership. Leadership because, and I'm not talking about political leadership, because as you see in the case of Rwanda, the damage has not been inflicted only by political leadership. Yes, political groups or foreign groups have been at the heart of what has happened in Rwanda, but I'm talking about also leaders at various levels, community leaders, church leaders, teachers, doctors. At every turn, even at a family level, certainly we need to have leadership, and the leadership that is very crucial and very indispensable to this process of healing is a leadership that understands, one, that they are part of this body that is sick. Because if a leader of Rwanda today, any leader in Rwanda today, would be blind to all these traumatic experiences that have piled up, how do you become a leader? What problem are you trying to solve if you don't understand that deep hurt that our society has undergone? And to understand, therefore, having understood this, to know that you are there to help your people, to serve your people, to overcome. The process of healing is a process of overcoming. Overcoming tragedy and building hope. That's really the essence of healing. To heal does not mean to be cured completely, nor does it mean that you are going to be immortal. But it's understanding that within the constraints of life and the conditions that you have, you can have a mindset and a course of action and choice that allows you to have the freedom to respond to those conditions. The challenge of a leader in Rwanda today, any leader, civil society, political society, a school, a church, a community, is really to understand that you're dealing with human beings that have suffered this much trauma, and very often this is in memory. It's memory that becomes also a source of our trauma, but it can also be a source of our rejuvenation and restoration. So understanding this trauma and knowing that you are a servant leader. So I'm talking about servant leadership. Not that you're going to be a carpet on which every people will tread on you. That's not what I'm talking about. But it's knowing that you're called a leader because you've been called to serve. That's what servant leadership is all about. It's really understanding the context of our society, which is pervasive trauma, and knowing that there is hope to overcome it. And there is that hope that should therefore inspire all of us to wake up every morning knowing that we are on this journey to healing, in that process of making the hills of blood, the hills of healing. It begs us to undertake certain risks, to move out of our comfort zone, but especially to understand that what hurts other people also hurts us. There is a term in African, one of the African philosophers has elaborated and talks about, Bishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa talks about, and he didn't invent that, but it's called Ubuntu, U-B-U-N-T-U, Ubuntu, which means, really translated, means humanness. And humanness is really based on understanding that human beings of any color, from a biological point of view, all human beings, it's kind of a paradox that we are largely the same in composition, though we are never completely the same. We are very diverse and very unique, and yet really we do share a lot the composition of our bodies. Whether you are black or white or yellow or whatever color, you put yourself in your brother's shoes, in your sister's shoes, they put themselves in your shoes to understand the pain that we have, or the joy that we have to share it. And to be able to do that, you really need to be, to have, besides the biological DNA, to have this DNA of Ubuntu, the humanness that we share. And so even in Rwanda, I only wish and pray that on this journey we shall continue to discover that besides the language which we share and living on the same hills on which often we've been led to kill each other, on the same hills that we have intermarried, that on these same hills we discover that even we do share much in common with other human beings in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, in America, everywhere on this little planet. The less we think about ourselves as simply Hutus and Tutsis and Twas, that we are so different that we find no common ground, that we can kill each other, that sorry, that will become the past that we must acknowledge as we build something much, much better as we begin to heal each other. And that cannot happen unless we have a spirit of love. That cannot happen unless we have a spirit of love, because it's in loving yourself and loving your neighbor, not doing anything to a neighbor as you will not do to yourself. And for people who are spiritually inclined, as I speak also one of my aunties as a Christian, because really that's the foundation of Christian belief, that you love God and you love yourself, as you love your neighbor as you love yourself. So unless you have this spirit of love, it's very difficult to recognize that the neighbor is like you. And unless you have a spirit of love, it will be very, very difficult to forgive. And yet, this history of Rwanda that I've been narrating, that has had these cycles of violence and repeated trauma, there is much forgiveness that is needed, because we can live a life of blaming the other and wishing that they get into trouble, or we have another chance to cause trouble to them, or we can have the spirit of forgiveness. And families and communities and nations are not the primary actors in the process of forgiveness. We forgive at the individual level. No state, no community, not even a family can impose or decree that I forgive somebody. I've got to get it from my heart that I'm forgiving. I do forgive because I also need forgiveness, but also because in the act of love and forgiveness, I receive my own healing. So indeed, love and forgiveness are really, really the soft and yet very indispensable components on this journey of healing and healing together. Rwanda is a nation whose people have gone through a lot of tragedies and traumatic experiences, especially in the last 120 years, and particularly in the last couple of decades, culminating in the events of 1994, the genocide and the civil war. And yet, having said all that, I believe that the Rwandan people have a spirit of resilience, because despite all that has happened to them, it's this spirit of surviving, of being resilient, that one can begin to see as a building block of the process of healing that every Rwandan desperately needs. And I believe that for all the blood that has been flowing on the hills of Rwanda, the country that famously described as the land of 1,000 hills, whose hills now are almost synonymous with hills of blood, this society and this nation can have its hills as hills of healing. And I believe that every Rwandan, at the individual level, in the families, in the communities that constitute Rwandan society, and indeed the whole nation, can embark on this pathway of looking at all the things that have happened are things that need to be acknowledged as we begin to create a safe environment in which each one of us can have a voice, but collectively we can have voices that begin to heal each other as we go along. And that possibility is founded on the hope that we have, that Rwandan people can be better and they can be able to work together, to build together, and that process of healing is indispensable because the past cannot help us except only to teach us that the kind of experiences we have had in the past can be cause for us to do better by doing the kind of things that can help our society heal in the future. So it's a hope for the future, a hope for our children and our grandchildren, the posterity that allows us to take the risk of overcoming our past and building the future together. And in that, it's probably most important to recognize that having the feeling for each other and recognizing that at the end of the day, we are all human beings, brothers to each other beyond simply being Hutus and Tutsis and Twa. And that recognition helps us to see the pain that the other person has had to have, that has, having the spirit of love that allows us to forgive each other because we all need forgiveness in order to heal, and the other person also needs forgiveness to heal. So that chemistry of love and forgiveness is what really, I think, will continue to be the DNA of the healing process that we are trying to push forward.